Democratic talk in our series Perspectives on the 2024 elections. On Wednesday night, we heard a panel on economic policy, and in October, there will be a panel hosted by the Department of Politics and International Affairs on the U.S. role in the world, foreign policy challenges facing the next president. If you want more information on that, you can go to go.wfu.edu/elections. This afternoon, I am pleased to welcome two distinguished historians to help us understand the historical context of our current moment. I'll introduce our speakers. They will each present in turn, and then we will save some time at the end for questions and answers. Before we do that, I would like to thank the History Department, the Office of the Dean of the College, the Office of Provost, and the Office of Civic and Community Engagement for supporting this event. And also a special thanks to my colleague, Simone Karen, who helped to organize this. So now I'll introduce our speakers. First, we will have Michael Kazin, Professor of History at Georgetown University, a former co-editor of Dissent magazine. Professor Kazin is an expert on political history of the 20th century, who is the author of 7 books, as well as publishing numerous articles in places like the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, and many other newspapers and magazines. His most recent book is What It Took to Win: A History of the Democratic Party. And after Professor Kazin, we will have Nicole Hemmer, who is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Carolyn T. and Robert M. Rogers Center for the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University. Professor Hemmer is an expert on the history of American conservatism who writes regularly for national and international outlets, including CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Fox, among others. She also hosts a podcast, Radiotopia's This Day, Esoteric Political History, and her latest book is titled Partisans, the Conservative Revolutionaries Remade American Politics in the 1990s. So, Professor Kazin, please help us welcome Professor Kazin.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm glad the rain has stopped, at least temporarily. Thanks to Professor Karen and Professor Coates for the invitation, to everybody in the History Department who's set up this visit. I thank you all again for coming. It's also intriguing to share the stage with Professor Hemmer, whose work I've long admired, and whose first book I hope to get published in a series I used to edit. So, but actually, we never met before. This is about the presidential election, but we're historians, so we're in context. So I'm going to give you a rather very brief sort of stroll, maybe jog through the history of the Democratic Party over the last 100 years. And don't despair, I'm going to talk about the present as well, but towards the end, we'll talk more about it, of course, when we get to questions and answers and comments and disagreements. So, start with this guy. Household name, I'm sure. Who was John W. Davis? Anybody? All right. John W. Davis was the Democratic candidate for president in 1924, exactly 100 years ago. A Wall Street lawyer who was a compromise candidate because there were a huge split in the Democratic Party at the time between mostly Southern Democrats who supported the Ku Klux Klan and supported Prohibition, and Northern Democrats, especially Catholic Democrats, who opposed Prohibition and opposed the Klan, which was very much opposed to Catholics at the time. The convention in New York City, the old Madison Square Garden, went on for 2 weeks, 103 ballots. And it was the first convention ever to be on the radio. So it was deeply embarrassing. John W. Davis was a compromise candidate. He was he wasn't in either camp, and nobody hated him. So he was respected in the legal community. So everyone knew he was going to lose, and he did lose. In fact, Davis got in 1924 28.8% of the popular vote for president, the lowest percentage of Democrats ever got for president since the beginnings of the Democratic Party way back in the early 19th century. So Democrats had nowhere to go but up from that point. Republicans were the majority party, but less than 10 years later, the Democrats became the majority party. How did they do that? Well, it was partly what happened when we talk about the Great Depression and the New Deal, Republicans being delegitimized because of the worst depression in American history, but also Democrats had something to go by. They had a deep tradition of what I call in my book moral capitalism. That is defending the interests of ordinary people, which for much of their history was ordinary white people only. They did this in two different ways. One, they opposed monopoly. In the interest of small farmers, the interest of small business people. Here's a democratic, rather scary democratic cartoon from the late 19th century. Monopoly gobbling up the whole country. This is from a democratic cartoonist. And also they supported the wage earner. First of all, the wage earners before there were strong labor unions, and then very much supportive of labor unions, then the American Federation of Labor unions. In fact, 1908 was the first time that the major Federation of American Unions ever supported a major party political candidate. It was this guy up there, William James Bryan. This is an earlier campaign he ran where he's defending the worker, but the man on the left there was the campaign manager for William McKinley, the Republican, 1896, who Democratic cartoonists also depicted with a suit with dollar signs, check dollar signs on the suit to show that he was this terrible greedy monopolist. And according to Democrats, the Republicans in that election, also elections after that, were basically coercing wage earners to vote for Republicans, saying if you don't vote for Republicans and Democrats elected, you'll get laid off. That's not really true for the most part, but nevertheless, that's something Democrats used, and they did have labor on their side. They were the more pro-labor party, even as early as the early part of the 20th century. And really, since 1908, the first time the major labor federation of the country supported a major party candidate for president, only twice since then has the major labor federation in America, the AFL, then the AFL-CIO, not supported the Democratic candidate for president. Well, go back to the 1930s, well, 1920s actually. There was something happening in the 20s which people don't really think about very much, is that women sort of kept the party going in the 1920s. One of the things I found in my research which surprised me, the Democratic Party was broke in the mid-20s. They were done so badly in national elections. The only base they had was in the White South, and places like North Carolina. And so there were some wealthy Democratic women who were forward-minded women who've been in the suffrage movement, who were involved in settlement houses in New York and other places. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of them, the, of course, wife of the future president. And some of these wealthy women basically kept the Democratic Party going. The Democratic National Committee in the mid-1920s was housed within the Women's National Democratic Club, a very nice building in Washington, D.C. So without women, the Democratic Party would have been totally broke and have nowhere to have its meetings and would have its offices. That changed in the late 20s, but for a while there, women kept the party going. But they also kept the party going because they held out for a program which became basically the New Deal program. Money for women with children, protection for workers, higher tax on the rich. It was a woman-centered reform program, but it expanded to include people of both genders. Well, the Democratic Party then becomes a majority party in the 1930s, after being a minority party for much of the previous few decades since the 1890s. But it doesn't do it by itself. Sometimes there's a sort of myth about how parties advance in America, that somehow it all comes from the top. All comes from presidents, comes from maybe policymakers, comes from people living in Congress. But in fact, the politics of democracy in this country, in both major parties, depends as much on social movements, organizing people from below, and getting them to support a party, to push that party to support its programs and its policies, as it does from messaging, good messaging from the top down. And that was very much happening in the 1930s. What was the movement in the 1930s? It was the industrial labor movement. The Congress of Industrial Organizations and also the old American Federation of Labor became more of an industrial labor federation than it had been before. The numbers of workers in labor unions in 1933 was 3 million at the pit of the Great Depression. By the end of World War II, it was 15 million. 3 million to 15 million, and most of those unions were very supportive of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was supportive of them. And here's a picture of one of the leading unions at the time, the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, which became the United Steelworkers, still around, though much shadow of its former self. And these are, the kind of white workers now that Democrats have been losing in recent years. And the United Steelworkers itself has been declining in numbers for a long time, with much steel being made overseas. Here's a graphic by a left-wing artist showing, both male and female members of industrial unions together. And also one of the important things that happened in the late 30s, in large part because the labor unions of the CIO, the Country Industrial Organization, the auto workers, the United Electrical Workers, the steel workers, meat packers, and others. These are the first really big unions in American history which were interracial. The union movement before this point had been, there have been black people in it, but the union had mostly been segregated. There were black locals and there were white locals, and that was true in the North as well, in places like North Carolina. But in the late 30s, the CIO organized black and white workers together. And here's a example of that. In fact, he said interracial committee. And that helped, together with New Deal creating jobs for black workers and various public works jobs, that moved black workers, black people in general, black voters in general, from being Republicans, where they could vote, to being mostly Democrats. And the unions had a lot to do with that, because the unions convinced their members that the Democratic Party was a better party for them. It was carrying out programs that were going to help them, creating jobs, supporting union elections, and various other programs. And so black workers said, now the Democrats are in my interest. Still in the South, in the so-called Solid South, segregation was still a rule, but in the unions it was integrated, and that was true in the North, especially where there's not segregation. So this is an important change. So the labor movement became a keystone of this new Democratic majority. That constituency that formed a social movement then generated money for the Democrats and also canvassers. Interesting statistic, in 1936, the leading institutional contributor to the Democratic Party to Franklin Roosevelt's re-election campaign, where he won a landslide re-election in 1936, was a union, the United Mine Workers Union, an integrated union, one of the largest unions in America. And of course, the New Deal also built the Democrats into a majority party by giving people things. Social Security, of course, most importantly, which is very controversial when it was passed, but since then has become something that no politician in America is going to oppose. But the Democrats, they built things. The Tennessee Valley Authority, for example, bringing electricity to people all over the South, creating dams, water power. But the Democrats were still a growing coalition, and still were a coalition in which the white South was essential to its power. So the man who was in charge of the committee, which appropriated funds for the Tennessee Valley Authority, one of the largest public works enterprises in American history, was this guy, John Rankin from Mississippi. He co-sponsored the act. He was a completely overt anti-Semite and racist. And he didn't like Albert Einstein because he was Jewish. He thought he was a communist, man who, of course, his ideas were pretty essential to creating the atomic bomb. So you had a very broad coalition, and that's basically truth as about any party becomes a majority party in this country. It's going to be a very broad coalition. You had people who were secretly members of the Communist Party, who were Democrats, and you had people like John Rankin, who had said nice things about Adolf Hitler. That was a very broad coalition. It was a coalition based primarily among people who were poorer in America, who suffered during the Great Depression. And that was very much a selling point for the party. Well, eventually, by the late 1940s, the Democratic Party decides officially to embrace civil rights. There's a famous convention in 1948 where some Southern Democrats walk out of the convention because the Democrats for the first time pass a platform which goes on record supporting civil rights bill. Also at the same time, there were black politicians elected in cities around the country. One of the most important of them was Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was called Mr. Civil Rights. And when he was in Congress, before the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, Powell did something which was very controversial. He wanted anytime federal money was going to go to a state or to a locality where segregation was the rule, and that was of course true in most of the South at the time, he opposed it. It's called the Powell Amendment. It never passed, but he kept putting it into bills saying, I want you to know, I want you to be on record as opposing segregation. He wanted to put his own party on record as much as he wanted to put Republicans on record. And the man who gave the speech in 1948, which called for the Democrats to be in favor of the Civil Rights Bill, which finally got passed in 1964, was the guy on the left, Hubert Humphrey, who at the time was mayor of Minneapolis, then becomes a senator, and becomes then vice president, in large part because he gets the Civil Rights Bill passed in 1964. And then he wins as vice president in this landslide election in 1964 with Lyndon Baines Johnson as a presidential candidate. And he's friends with, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife, and they got a rally way after the election. They're all smiling because they just won this landslide election. Now, other things happened in the late 60s, which weren't so good for the Democratic Party. In fact, in the late 60s, the Democratic Party stops being the majority party in America, which it had been from the early 1930s at the pit of the Great Depression up until the late 1960s. What happens is a cultural divide in America, which you all have heard about. There's an anti-war movement, there's a new feminist movement, there's a new LGBT movement, then called the gay and lesbian movement. There's a counterculture, which at first is opposed to the Democratic Party because they're opposed to the war in Vietnam, which is being prosecuted by Democrats. But by early 1972, a lot of these people in the Democratic Party, and they're supporting an anti-war candidate from South Dakota, Senator George McGovern. McGovern loses in a historic landslide to Richard Nixon, in part because he's seen as wanting to just surrender in Vietnam, and the Vietnam War is still popular enough among a lot of Americans. They don't like the idea of a major party candidate basically saying, let's give victory to the communists in Vietnam. But also he's seen as a candidate of this minority of countercultural people that for the first time, there's a gay speaker at the convention in 1972. There's a debate about whether abortion rights should be part of the platform. The Democratic Party is before Roe v. Wade, and still abortion rights is very unpopular among a lot of Democrats, especially a lot of Catholic Democrats. So McGovern's campaign, even though it's a campaign which is more inclusive in terms of different, more diverse than other campaigns the Democrats have run in their history, nevertheless, is still, that diversity is still a minority diversity. And the Democrats from this point on, they don't become a minority party, but they no longer the majority party. They've lost that ability to unite this very broad coalition of groups. And also they've lost more and more, they're beginning to lose the White South as well. The last 50 years, what's happened? Well, first of all, Democrats, of course, still want to win. So in the late 80s, especially after Democrats had lost several presidential elections, 72, 80, 84, 88, there's a group called Democratic Leadership Council, DLC, which is based amongst white Southern Democrats. People like Chuck Robb from Virginia, people like Al Gore from Tennessee, Bill Clinton from Arkansas, and they begin to say, let's move to the middle. Let's not talk about organized labor so much, which itself was already declining. Let's talk a lot about crime and be tough on crime. And so even though this Bill and Hillary, even though they embrace the legacy of FDR, of the New Deal, they're moving to the right. What's say move to the center in order to win election. And Bill Clinton, by the way, was a former anti-war demonstrator when he was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. And he actually worked for the McGovern campaign in 1972, this hopeless losing campaign. So he made a very savvy move to the center to be elected governor of Arkansas for the first time, and then to win the Democratic nomination for president in 1992. But under Clinton, and ever since then as well, Democrats still are the party of most people in these, you might say, countercultural minorities. Here is gay demonstrators demonstrating in 1976 Democratic Convention. And ever since the mid-70s, most people who are LGBT community have been Democrats. So that legacy continues. But gradually, and now I'm getting something that you all know, Democrats began to lose what used to be the core constituency in the party, white working class people. Some in unions, some outside unions, and this is true across regions. But especially, they began to lose working class people in the South, partly because of opposition to civil rights, and then began to lose people in the North as well. Beginning in the 1990s, and especially in the first couple of decades of the century. And here there's a dramatic example. Look sometime in Wikipedia or elsewhere to look at the votes in two interesting states, California on one hand, West Virginia on the other hand. California used to be a Republican state. Richard Nixon was from there, Ronald Reagan was from there. On election night, California people didn't really, worry. In the 70s and 80s, it was pretty clear Republicans were going to carry California. People just assumed they were going to carry California. Just like now, people assume Republicans would carry Alabama on election night. And they also assumed the Democrats would carry West Virginia. West Virginia, since the 1930s, had been a union state, coal mining state, based on United Mine Workers, this leading union in the 1930s. We continue to be a major union in West Virginia. The head of the United Mine Workers, John O. Lewis, the guy on the left, was the head of the CIO, one of the big industrial labor formation formed in the 1930s, and he continued to be the head of the United Mine Workers until he died many years later. To be a West Virginia working class person of any race meant you were pretty much going to be a Democrat. You learned from the union, Democrats of the party supported Social Security, supported the right to organize a union, supported healthcare plan that the federal government helped contribute to, that the United Mine Workers gave everybody who worked for the union or everybody who was in a family of someone who worked for the union. They had in effect national health insurance or state health insurance for mine workers and their families, bolstered by the federal government. But then mines began to decline, and a lot of young people moved away because they couldn't find good jobs. And what replaced them for a lot of people was evangelical churches, Protestant churches, some conservative Catholic churches, which taught people that multicultural Democratic Party based in the cities was their enemy. It was secular humanist. It was a sinful party, party that was for abortion, for gay rights, and so forth. So West Virginia went from being one of the most democratic states in the country in like 1980s, as late as that, in the early 90s, to being now the most Republican state in the country, with that probably Wyoming pretty close to it. Donald Trump won it by 40%. Last two elections. Here he is. Remember that? Trump digs coal. California, on the hand, stopped being a very industrial state, where a lot of white working class people in the southern part of California, and became a state where Latinos were often very active in politics, partly because they opposed the anti-immigrant, anti-Latino agenda of the Republican Party of the state, and gradually but surely, California became a 2-to-1 Democratic state. So the two states really changed hands because white working class people ceased to be an important group in California. They're still an important group in West Virginia, but they changed their politics for some of the reasons that I mentioned. We're doing out of time. Almost done. What about the future of the party? Well, I think we can talk about what's going to happen a month or 5 weeks from now, if you want. But I'm a historian, I don't prophesy. It's hard enough to explain the past, much less to predict the future. But I think going forward, Democrats are going to have to make a choice. They could be the party of these people, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders. Well, Bernie won't be around that much longer, but he's older than Joe Biden. But in other words, a really progressive party, a party that's in favor of Green New Deal, of national health insurance, of trying to put the party on the side of organizing unions as much as possible, as quickly as possible. Really a progressive party, a party that in Europe would be called a social democratic party, for a much larger welfare state and much larger, role of the government in people's lives. and also for much more lenient view towards immigrants, both legal and illegal. Or it could be the kind of party that these folks support, not, conservative, but much more modern. A politics of, being more Trumpy on immigration without some of Trump's hostile rhetoric towards illegal migrants. A party much more friendly towards big business, a party that is friendly towards labor, but is not going to argue about, trying to alienate business because of that. A party, in other words, that's trying to cobble together a coalition of moderates and progressives at the same time. This is going to be a very difficult challenge because, on the one hand, you can't make it as a major political party in America. You can't become a dominant party again unless you're a broad coalition. But being a broad coalition comes with dangers as well. Because if one big group in the party doesn't like what the party as a whole at the top is doing, then they can decide to at least not vote, or maybe vote for somebody else, the way some people opposed the war in Gaza or have been threatened to do. At least they were a few months ago when Joe Biden was still going to be the nominee. So keeping this broad coalition together is very difficult. But if you don't do that, you don't win elections in an ongoing way. And if you don't win elections, you can't really change the country the way you want to change the country. So it's a dilemma. And I'll leave you with that dilemma because I've talked long enough already. Thank you.
Want to make sure to get in one more plug for the book here.
Oh yeah, sorry. I was going to say, if you want to know more, read the book. A little advertisement for myself.
Well, I want to reiterate Professor Kazan's thanks to the organizers today and for all of you for being out here. It's a real pleasure to get to talk to you about some of the history behind the two parties that have led to this moment. And a lot of what Professor Kazan said sort of prefigured what I'm going to talk about, which is how the Republican Party has changed since World War II. And a lot of that has to do with the relationship between a faction of the party, in this case, the conservative movement, and the Republican Party structure itself. Because as Professor Kazan was explaining about the Democratic Party, it was a broad coalition in most of the mid-20th century, and so too was the Republican Party. The Republican Party, up until the 1980s, had moderate Republicans and liberal Republicans and conservative Republicans. And so part of the story that I'm going to talk about today is how it becomes a right-wing party and what that costs the Republican Party. And it largely cost it this ability to win big majorities. So the story I'm going to talk about why the GOP abandoned popular or majoritarian politics, how it goes from this 1964 election, which LBJ and Hubert Humphrey won by astounding margins. Barry Goldwater, who was really the first movement conservative to become the Republican nominee. It just didn't work. He was a very unpopular candidate. He mostly just makes inroads into the Deep South, in large part based on his decision to vote against the Civil Rights Act in the summer of 1964. 16 years later, a movement conservative runs as the Republican nominee, and he wins in an even bigger landslide. So something changes between 1964 and 1980. You've heard about the changes in the Democratic Party coalition and how the Republicans began to soak up the white working class. But there's something very popular among the electorate in Reagan's politics and in conservative politics by 1980 that was not there in 1964. So you go from Goldwater's wipeout to Reagan's revolution to a party now that's actually the 2016 election, not the 1988 one, to the 2016 election, which is emblematic of the kind of national politics the Republican Party now has to operate in, where its ability to win the presidency is largely dependent on the Electoral College. As most of you will know, the Republican Party has won the national popular vote for president only one time since 1988. And increasingly, they're relying on the Electoral College to get those victories in the presidency. And even today, now that Joe Biden has dropped out and Kamala Harris has become the Democratic nominee, you don't hear a lot about Donald Trump winning the national popular vote. You hear like, how are they gonna make this electoral college victory happen? Because they're not playing for the national vote. So how did the Republican Party go from being able to win these landslide popular elections to not really vying for the popular vote much at all? The story, I think, is about the relationship between the right and the Republican Party. And to kick it off, we have to go back to this period before World War II. Just as World War II is breaking out in Europe, and the United States is trying to decide, do we get involved or don't we? So you have the America First movement in the United States. And the America First movement, which was opposed to US intervention in World War II, starts off as a pretty wide tent in terms of political philosophies. You have socialists who are part of it, you have pacifists, but you also have nationalists, conservatives, German Bund members. And over time, over the course of the 1 year or so that the America First Committee exists, it becomes a more conservative, anti-Semitic organization. But for many people who would become leaders in the conservative movement of the Cold War period, the 1950s and the 1960s, they actually get their political start with America First in opposition to World War II. And they learn a few things about American politics from their experience in the America First Committee that would continue to define conservative politics in the United States. And that is, they believed that their stance on the war was not being rejected by the American people, but was being blacked out by the major institutions in the United States. Because in 1940, both the Democrats and the Republicans nominated a candidate who is open to intervention. They feel like there are no media outlets that represent their point of view. And so they feel like there isn't a debate about the biggest issue of the day, whether or not the US should go into the war. And this idea that their ideas are not being rejected, but they're being oppressed, is something that is going to carry forward on the right. But I mention it in part because in 1940, the right doesn't see itself as having a home in either party. I also mention it because America First is one of those places where we can see the American right's, if not deep embeddedness with radical politics, and often anti-Semitic and racist politics, at least their comfort with being in a coalition that includes such people. Because of their experiences in America First, the right, the conservative movement in the United States, saw itself as kind of being out in the wilderness, outside of the main institutions of power. Wasn't exactly true, but they at least knew they weren't in charge of all of the major institutions in the United States. And they did believe they had a potential future in the Republican Party because of a man named Robert Taft. Robert Taft was an Ohio senator. He was a grandson of an American president, William Taft. And he was a little heterodox in his politics, but he was conservative. And he was particularly opposed to US involvement in international institutions like the United Nations, like NATO. And because of his opposition to these new international institutions after World War II, he draws a competitor into the race for the Republican nomination in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower was one of the biggest celebrities in the United States. He basically won World War II, that made him incredibly popular. Both parties wanted to draft him as their presidential nominee, and ultimately he gets drawn in because he's like, I know one thing, Robert Taft can never be president. So he runs against Robert Taft, defeats him pretty handily. And the way the conservatives look at this, again, is not our guy was rejected. It's that nomination process was rigged. It was rigged by Eastern elites and people in finance and internationalists who would not let somebody who shared our philosophy see the light of day and win the Republican nomination. And what's interesting about this is that then in the 1950s, when Dwight Eisenhower is the nominee and then becomes president of the United States as a Republican, the conservative movement that's beginning to emerge, you see it in, publications like National Review and Human Events. You see it in organizations like the John Birch Society. It is organizing in opposition to Dwight Eisenhower and the Republican Party. Of course, they're also against New Deal liberalism, but they're really mad about Dwight Eisenhower. There's a reason why the founder of the John Birch Society calls him a conscious conspirator with communist conspiracy, and why National Review is always running editorials against him. There's this idea that, again, there should be a home for us in the Republican Party, and there's not. That is why they begin to organize for a presidential candidate who can sort of lead the party into a more conservative future. And the person that they choose is Barry Goldwater, who is the senator from Arizona. He's elected senator in 1952, really libertarian, one of those people who, if you ever see like a 99-1 vote in the Senate, that one vote was probably Barry Goldwater. He was very dogmatic when it came to his politics. And he became a kind of darling of the conservative movement. They saw him as their potential future. And in 1960, a bunch of conservative activists get together. They put together a draft Goldwater campaign. Doesn't work out. And Goldwater, despite the fact that he votes against legislation, he's a party guy. If his party doesn't want him, he's not gonna rock the boat. And so he sort of steps aside so that Richard Nixon can become the nominee. Nixon, of course, loses in a very narrow election in 1960. And then in 1964, the conservatives finally get what they call their chance for a choice between conservatism and liberalism. You have Lyndon Johnson, who has taken on the mantle of John F. Kennedy, who is moving forward on civil rights, who will be moving forward in the years to come on the Great Society, who is an avatar of liberalism in the United States, against Barry Goldwater, who is very much the beating heart of the conservative movement in this period. And I showed you what happened in that initial slide. It is a landslide loss for the Republican Party. It fractures the party. I mean, even in the run-up to the election in 1964, it's actually a lot like what happened to the Republican Party in 2016. There were a lot of Republicans, and at that time, there were many, many more moderate liberal Republicans, and they were like, we can't support this guy. His politics are too fringe and too radical. And so you have this landslide loss, but again, conservatives are not deterred. One of the big slogans that come out of this election on the right is 27 million Americans can't be wrong. 27 million people voted for Goldwater. Now, of course, that implies that the 46 million people who voted for LBJ could be wrong, but that idea that, okay, we had a chance for a choice. We didn't actually get a fair election. The press was against Goldwater. The American people didn't really get to hear what he believed in. And yet, even though you had that kind of criticism of the system that came after the 1964 election, a lot of conservatives were like, okay, but we really haven't convinced enough Americans that we have the right ideas. We're going to have to make some compromises. And their big compromise in 1968 was Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon was someone who didn't engender a lot of trust from conservatives and other people while he was running for president. For conservatives, he was Eisenhower's vice president, right? He had already sold out the movement in 1952. And they also believe that, like, you can't trust Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is going to say anything he needs to say to win, but he's not going to be loyal to you in the end. All the same, William F. Buckley Jr., who's pictured here, he was the founder of a magazine called National Review. He was seen as sort of the leading conservative intellectual of his day. In the run-up to the 1968 campaign, he came up with this maxim that the right should support the most viable right-word candidate who can win. Right? We can't just choose a candidate based on the purity of their conservative beliefs. we have to pick a candidate who can actually win an election. And so for that reason, Buckley supports Richard Nixon. Conservatives are divided, but enough conservatives support Nixon that he's able to eke out a very slim victory in 1968. And while the conservatives were learning to compromise, Nixon was learning some lessons too, because he looked at the 1964 election and he said, okay, you can't win an election as a Republican with only conservative support. But nor can you win an election as a Republican without conservative support. So this is a moment when the movement and the party are beginning to come together through compromise. And at the time, Nixon wins this very narrow victory over Hubert Humphrey. There's somebody that we haven't mentioned yet who is also in that race, and that is George Wallace. Where were those white working class voters who were beginning to abandon the Democratic Party going? They weren't going to Nixon quite yet. They were going to George Wallace, the former governor of Alabama, best known for being a segregationist, who had put together this sort of set of political ideas that were socially conservative, were racially conservative, but were economically populist. So he had this desire to use government to help the white working class, while also folding in these racial appeals to white voters. White voters not just in the South, but in what would become known as the Rust Belt as well. And Wallace takes a big chunk of votes in the 1968 election. I think he wins like 13% of the popular vote. And in 1972, Richard Nixon basically gets all of Wallace's votes. So he moves towards Wallace. And that is how he begins to build this enormous majority in 1972. However, it's also part of the reason he wins an enormous majority, not the ideal candidate at the moment. But Wallace, too, is showing the Republican Party a way forward through a more racist set of politics. The other important thing to say about Wallace before we move on is that there was a big debate on the right about Wallace. Because people like William F. Buckley and movement conservatives were like, what? His policies aren't conservative. He's also like a New Deal liberal, but you just like him because of the way that he talks and because of these racist appeals that he's making. And they're like, we make racist appeals too, but you just learned to dog whistle them a little bit more. And so there is this real debate in the conservative movement about what is the right? Is it conservative or is it populist? And the right that you are going to see emerge in the years that follow is one that tries to make a big tent out of both of those. Let's be the home to doctrinaire conservatives, but let's also be the home to populists. And a very popular right comes on the heels of this. In the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan wins, in a big landslide in 1980, in an even bigger landslide in 1984, and he's doing it by building big popular majorities. And what's interesting about those big popular majorities in 1980 and 1984 is that they also fit in with the kind of rhetoric that Reagan had developed over the course of his political career as a Cold War conservative. Reagan was someone who spoke the language of democracy and freedom. He didn't always live the ideas of democracy and freedom. He opposed the renewal of the Voting Rights Act in 1982. He supported dictatorships in a number of countries. But there were ways in which his commitment to kind of idea of democracy really did shape his policies. And the big ones are immigration and trade. He believed that the United States' best argument against the Soviet Union and the communist system was essentially open borders, the free movement of people and goods and capital. And so he had a particular kind of conservatism that really worked in the Cold War and really supported a kind of small d democratic consensus in the United States during the Cold War years. A consensus that was very imperfect, but in which at least both parties had a version of democracy and majoritarianism that they fully supported. And that begins to come to an end when the Cold War comes to an end. The logic which had made this very democratic conservatism possible, or at least very popular majoritarian conservatism possible, begins to go away. And you get a new conservatism, a new right in the 1990s. The radicalization of the right in the 1990s is a big enough story that I wrote a whole book about it, but I'm going to give you kind of a gloss on it here. By mentioning just a few things. The person who is sort of the best representative of the conservatives that emerged after Reagan and began to create a new post-Reagan, post-Cold War right is Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan, who when he ran for president in 1992, had never held elected office, had served as a staffer in a couple of Republican administrations, but really was well known because he was a media figure. He was a host of CNN's Crossfire. He was a regular on PBS's McLaughlin Group. To the extent that Americans knew Pat Buchanan, it was largely through television. And he uses that as a platform to run for president and to put forward a new idea of what the right might look like. He ran on a call for America First that he explicitly tied back to the America First movement of the 1940s. He called for trade restriction. He called for non-intervention in foreign policy, and he called for an end to immigration to the United States. It's Pat Buchanan who is going to pioneer strongly anti-immigrant politics in the modern Republican Party. In 1992, when he runs, he calls for what he calls a Buchanan fence, which is a wall between the US and Mexico. That year's platform, because Buchanan is going to have the first call that the Republican Party puts forward for a wall on the US and southern border. And he's also a gun absolutist. This is a moment in which the rights embrace of absolute gun rights is going to burn up. So in 1993 and 1994, you get two massive pieces of gun control legislation, the Brady Bill and the assault weapons ban. Both of them are supported by Ronald Reagan, and both of them are opposed by Pat Buchanan and this new right. And over the course of the 1990s, this is going to become an absolutist position for the party. The entertainment politics that Pat Buchanan pioneers is also going to become much more popular on the right, but not just on the right, across the spectrum. The 1990s is the decade where the wall between entertainment and politics goes away. Ronald Reagan had been an actor. They sort of laundered his experience through being governor of California. In the 1990s, you're going to get people like Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan, who are primarily known to people through television. You're also going to get shows like Bill Maher's Politically Incorrect and The Daily Show on Comedy Central. You're going to get initiatives like MTV's Rock the Vote, where you have this wall between media and politics, and entertainment and politics just sort of disappear entirely. And you also have in the 90s the specter of political violence. Just two quick examples of that. This is the decade that the anti-abortion movement begins to become much more deadly. You see the first murder of an abortion doctor, see many more to follow, bombing of abortion clinics. And this is also when you see the rise of the militia movement in the United States, a movement that is going to grow rapidly over the course of the first few years of the 1990s. And then in 1995, results in the Oklahoma City bombing. And that leads to where we are today, a Republican Party that has moved increasingly to the right and increasingly away from majoritarian politics. And just to wrap up, I will mention one big moment, and that's the Tea Party, which starts in 2009. After major victories in the 2010 midterms, what you see is not only big changes in Congress, but big changes in state houses and in state legislation. In the years that followed 2010, the kinds of initiatives that you see at the state level are attacks on public unions, strong restrictions on abortion rights, that effectively outlaw abortion in some states before the Dobbs decision. And you also see new restrictions on voting. You've seen this all here in North Carolina, right? The stripping away of power from political officials, increased gerrymandering. A way of turning the system so that you no longer have to win popular majorities, that you can win without winning. And I think that is where the Republican Party is today, and I think that's structuring the election that's going around as well.
Thank you to both Professor Kazin and Professor Hemmer. I have one question, and then I will use sort of moderator's privilege, and then I will open it up to the audience. And the question I was thinking of as I was looking at both of your fantastic talks was, how do you explain the sort of variants that you described across the 20th century, the rise and fall of huge majorities in both parties? On the one hand, you can think about structural changes, the rise and fall of union density, maybe new media, that sort of thing. On the other hand, you have the question of how people pitch their policy proposals in order to either have a broad tent or the narrow tent. I'm not sure if that's the thing. And so the question I have is sort of about contingency and agency. Like, is this a question where certain different decisions at different times would have made a huge difference, or where changes of luck made a big difference? I'm thinking of, for instance, if the clerk who designed the ballot in Palm Beach County in 2000, hadn't designed it in the way so that lots of people who thought they were voting for Gore actually voted for Buchanan, and therefore Gore lost Florida and lost the election. So if something like that had gone a slightly different direction, would that have made an actual shift in party composition, or is there sort of more of a big structural changes that are driving these rises and falls?
It's a great question. Kind of factual, of course, since as historians, we can talk about this forever. Saturday Night Live used to have a routine. What if Eleanor Roosevelt could fly? Which is maybe kind of sexist, but they used to. What if Franklin Roosevelt could fly? Al Gore, president, who knows? Would the U.S. have invaded Iraq and obviously Afghanistan? Well, 9/11 probably would happen anyway. So who knows? I think and what Nicole said is important in this. We both agree on this. I think is that when the core activists in your party are pushing one way, and they're well organized, in social movements, in organizations like Heritage Foundation or John Birch Society, place like that, organizations like that, then it's very difficult over a length of time for the establishment in the party to oppose them, because those are the people who get the vote out. Those are the people who get you enthused, So without John Birch Society, Barry Goldwater probably wouldn't have won nominations in 1964. So not surprising that at the 64 convention in San Francisco, which didn't used to be as liberal as city, but anyway, the convention was in Cal Palace, San Francisco, 64. That's where he made the famous speech. We said extremism and the pursuit of liberty is no vice, etc. But he said that because he didn't love John Birch Society, but they were his people, so you can't avoid the people. So I think that kind of structure is part of it. And of course, what's happening in external events matters as well. Obviously, I didn't mention the war in Vietnam, for example. I mean, I did in passing the anti-war movement, but obviously the movement against the war in Vietnam, which I was part of when I was in college, both helped to turn Americans against the war, but also the way it was perceived as anti-American and anti-troops, and also turned a lot of people who didn't like the war against the anti-war movement, which also turned them against the Democratic Party, when the Democratic Party, in fact, embraced the anti-war movement. So external events obviously matter greatly.
And if I had to answer it, I would say three things, and I'll say them quickly: media, economics, and demographics. Absolutely, the media environment matters enormously. It has created different incentives for politicians. The politicians that you hear from the most and sort of are exposed to the most are there because they are able to grab your attention, and in a particular attention, media infrastructure that's usually driven by over-the-top and outlandish claims. But that was preceded by the rise of cable news, right? That really incentivized a particular type of politics. The difference in economics, from the late 1960s on, the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest in the United States grew dramatically. And there was a hollowing out of the middle economically in the United States, and that creates enormous instability in a country. And I think that that has been reflected in our politics because of the failure of politicians to solve that particular economic problem or even treat it as a problem at all. And then demographically, up until around 1990, the composition of the United States was between 87 and 90% white. Certainly the electorate was even whiter than that. And it's not anymore. And the Republican Party, at least by 1972, was chasing after the white vote in ways that was alienating to non-white voters. And part of the reason they've lost the ability to put together majorities is because there aren't as many white people as there.
The most important acts in the last 100 years of American history, most people don't know about, the Immigration Reform Act in 1965. Before then, immigrants coming from Africa, from Asia, were very tiny, Eastern
Like
Europe.
100 people a year.
And since then, you know, the largest, one of the largest immigrant groups in the country now is Indian Americans. And be very few of them if the law hadn't been changed in 1965. And Democrats passed that as part of the Great Society. They didn't expect that to happen, you know. You know, once you allow people to come to the United States legally, a lot of people want to come for a lot of good reasons.
Thank you. So I will open the floor. I see a question. I will come bring you the microphone.
I probably don't need it.
There's, I can hear you fine, so it sounds like you know. Go ahead.
First and foremost, Hoya Saxon.
Sorry?
I said Hoya Saxon. You both make an argument to run to the middle. Build coalitions to be successful. And yet it seems to me, and I'd like to hear your comments on why does the operational system run to the corners and to the extremes?
This is such a great question, because I think that there are structural reasons for it. Part of it is that in the 1990s, I'll take the Republican Party since that's what I'm talking about. You know, after the 1992 election, both parties were like, how do we get pro voters? Because that's how we're going to win the next election. And for the Republicans, they had cobbled together at the congressional level the Contract with America. And it was very unpopular among Democrats, but among Republicans, the reason that it was put together was it was full of what they called 60% issues. That is, nothing could make it into the contract that didn't poll with at least 60% public support. They're like, we're not going to be divisive. We're going to go after popularity. This is who we're going to be. And then they got into office and they governed very differently. Under Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House, Gingrich really saw polarization as a powerful political tool. He really believed that he could use polarization to drive essentially disgust toward Democrats and hold Republicans to the party even as it moved to the right. So that's one of the big issues. The polarization becomes a political tool in the 1990s that then leads to a much more polarized set of politics descriptively. The other big thing is that the parties as institutions weakened dramatically. They lost the ability to control the message. They lost the ability after Citizens United to control the money. And they lost the ability to control the movements that were shaping the party. And as the party lost that control, they lost the power to kind of shape primaries, right? To pick candidates who were more moderate and more appealing. And those choices then fell to the base of the party, and that led to increasingly radical candidates, where in some cases, you know, I think the Democratic Party was much slower to move to the left than the Republican Party was to the right. But it certainly meant in the case of the Republican Party that the Republican Party was kind of hollowed out in the middle because there just weren't moderate or liberal Republicans anymore. And so there's no there for that kind of broad tent.
There's a very good book, by the way, called The Hollow Parties by Sam Rosenfeld and Dan Schlossman, two political scientists, which goes into some of the details and looks at it historically because the party's been hollow. And one of the ironies about that is it was because of the Democratic split in 1968, the terrible convention they had in Chicago, which you probably heard about if you didn't live through it like I did. I was actually there demonstrating, but you know, people made a lot of comparisons this year. But though is 2024 going to be like 1968? I'm sure you saw those articles. But as a result of that, at that point, most of the delegates to those conventions were chosen by party bosses. Sometimes the delegates directly chosen by state bosses, they're sometimes they're friends, some who work for them, they want to be delegate, sure, be delegate. Well, that produced a mostly white, set and male set of delegates. 1972, when McGovern was a much more diverse party, because McGovern's elected is nominated in primaries, and since then, of course, everyone's elected in primaries and caucuses. No longer can the bosses control. But what that also means is that, like Nicole is saying, that individual groups can really push for a particular candidate, and the candidate can basically has to create their own business, and who better to create their business than a businessman, hint, hint. And so it doesn't matter so much if you have, the party bosses on your side. The party bosses aren't bosses anymore either, They're subservient, the bosses are subservient to the candidates. And that historically had not been true at all. Just one comment, you said, we think each party should move to the middle. I wouldn't say that so much. I think if you want to win, you have to say things that are popular and support ideas that are popular and have a big tent. But sometimes that can mean moving to the left. I mean, if 1932, for example, Al Smith wanted to get the nomination again, 1932, and he would not have been as liberal or progressive a candidate or president, certainly if he won, as Franklin D. Roosevelt. So Roosevelt, by in effect, embraced the labor movement once he gets into office too. That helps him to win a landslide in 1936. And helps Harry Truman to win 1948 too. He was almost, everyone predicted he was going to lose because labor was on his side then as well. So, it's not so much moderate as it is trying to figure out, which way, not the country is going, but which way the sort of public opinion is going and what positions you have to take in order to get a majority on your side. I mean, after all, it's about democracy. But democracy is not just being a moderate necessarily. Sometimes it can mean moving a more progressive direction because that's where people are going. And by the way, one thing I was going to say in my talk, one thing about the Democrats, I saw these two slides, AOC and Sanders on one hand and Harris and Walz on the other hand. There's 100 members of the Progressive Caucus in the House of Representatives right now. That's almost half the Democratic Congress people right now. That's a huge constituency. Now, some people join it because they want to say I'm progressive and they're not all that progressive. Like Kim Jeffries, for example, the majority leader is a member of the Progressive Caucus, at least he used to be, and he'll do whatever he needs to do to become speaker. But still, that's a big change from when Bill Clinton was president.
I think we'll just dispense with the microphone.
Yeah, so my question's kind of going to the last one, but polarization is now known as a major threat to American democracy now. And we have two options in each party. What would each party do to affect polarization and stop the effects of polarization? And which party, in your opinions, is more likely to take that step to stop the issue of polarization?
Polarization happens, I think, because neither party has a majority. And you might disagree with this. I don't think we've had a majority party for more than 50 years in this country, which is unusual in American history. It's never been this long a period where, yes, the Democrats have won the popular vote more often, but of course, Republicans control more states, I think, and obviously control, the House right now, and will probably control the Senate after this next election. So, it didn't used to be that way. It used to be Democrats were the majority party from the early 30s up until the late 60s or the 70s. Republicans were from the 1890s up until that point. There's a short period between 1874 and 1894, if you want to be precise about it, where there's neither party was majority party. The part of what produces polarization is because it becomes a zero-sum game. Democrats can't support anything Republicans want because then they'll help the Republicans and vice versa. The reason you had the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, for example, is because Democrats had overwhelming majorities and Northern Republicans voted for it. A higher percentage of Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act in the Senate, at least, I think, the Democrats. There's so many Southern Democrats. So the only way to do away with polarization, I think, who knows? I can't predict the future, is one party become majority party again. I don't see that happening anytime soon, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's the tricky thing. I mean, the incentive structure for the Republican Party is not toward depolarization.
Right.
Especially the media infrastructure that is so important to the party is really pushes toward polarization. And I think that ethos has been adopted more by the party. I think that there still is, or was until very recently within the Democratic Party, an ethos of bipartisanship. This was the Obama presidency, right? Like bipartisanship was at the core of that presidency. It's something that Obama not only talked about all the time, but actually believed. He believed that the best legislation was legislation that could be passed with bipartisan support. And that hasn't been the ethos of the Republican
Biden
Party.
thinks that too.
Yeah, he operationalizes it less.
Yeah.
But that hasn't been the ethos of the Republican Party for a longer time. And they have invested more in counter-majoritarian politics, which is to say the Supreme Court, gerrymandering, filibustering, voter restriction, than in trying to figure out how to build this big tent. The only way I would see the Republican Party being the force for depolarization is if they lose a ton. They lose a lot of elections, the counter-majoritarian stuff doesn't work anymore, and they to not go extinct, they have to do this. But people have been talking about that for a very long time, and it hasn't happened.
It's something to, that Nicole was saying in her talk, I think is really crucial. Is that for a lot of Americans, government's not working very well, look at the polls, and the polls are very close to the president. We look at, what's the poll people ask, a lot of pollsters ask, think the country's on the right track, maybe 25% think it is, 30%. I mean, that's astonishing and not good. And so when you have that situation, people are going to, put up the barricades against the other party because they're not going to trust the other party. There's a lot of reasons for that. The Great Recession was part of it. The problems with the debacle in Iraq and so forth. But with the Democrats' majority, for example, in the 60s, people trusted government. Polls said, believe it or not, up until mid-60s, late 60s, people asked, do you trust the government to do the right thing most of the time? Majority said yes. Can you imagine that happening today? Ronald Reagan famously said, what's that line? The worst thing you hear is, I'm from the government, I've come here to help, and that's most Americans, even a lot of Democrats, feel that way too. So as long as that's true, I think we're going to still be in this sort of, might call it crisis of democracy, but neither side trusts the other side, and neither side really trusts the government to do the right thing. Democrats don't trust the Supreme Court. When Democrats are in power, Republicans don't trust, the White House or Congress, and vice versa. That's the making part of strict partisanship there, right there. So anyway.
I would just add that, like, descriptively, they're right to say that the government doesn't work.
Yeah.
What is missing from that is that the government was deliberately broken, and there's a reason why we can't pass popular legislation in a democracy. And so that's part of the frustration, is that even when politicians want to pass popular legislation, they can't do it. And we've seen some innovation at the state level, Medicaid expansion, even in red states, abortion access, even in red states. But that's not enough, right? People are frustrated because the federal government doesn't work. And as long as people are committed to keeping the federal government from working, you're going to have that disaffection.
And sometimes people are moving. Other people move from state to state primarily because politics. They move for their families, for jobs, for the careers, for education, other things, but maybe for climate. But it's also true there's a sort of sorting going on, I think, to a certain degree. Some states become more, like North Carolina has become, more liberal because people are moving in from other places, I think, and the economy more diversified than it used to be. But I think in some ways it's not a bad thing that we have experimentation take place in the states that can't take place, and some interesting things being passed in states that can't happen in the federal government. Louis Brandeis became a first Jewish Supreme Court justice during the Wilson administration 100 years ago. He said states were the laboratories of democracy, and I think that's a little too romantic perhaps, but it's possible to try things out on the state level. Of course, from my point of view, on the blue state level, because I'm a progressive, but obviously Republicans have tried different things on the state level as well. And so I think it's, the federal system makes that possible in a way not possible in some other countries where the different departments or different provinces don't have the same power that we do here. So, maybe that's one of the ways, I'm not sure that'll do with partisanship, but one of the ways that people begin to see possibilities of solving some of the serious problems, that they happen at the state level first, and then sometimes they'll be then adopted nationally.
I think this is like depolarization will happen at the local and the state level.
Yep.
Long before it happens at the national level.
Not so long ago, even a minor misstep for a presidential candidate could end their candidacy. I remember Howard Dean laughed inappropriately one day and his candidacy ended. Gary, I'm sorry, I forget his last name.
Hart.
Yeah, was, picture was taken of him with a woman who wasn't his wife,
Kind of right.
sitting on his lap on a boat, and his candidacy ended. Today, a candidate can say anything and do anything inappropriate, and the candidacy does not end. What is the change that has allowed that to happen?
So there's one term that I often turn to for a question like
I'm
this.
sorry?
There's one term that I often turn to for a question like this, and that's negative polarization. Which is to say that, because party identity has become such a core personal identity, fealty to your candidate has become a lot stronger, and it's been much more difficult to shake through, everything from personal picadillos to literal crimes. But I don't think it's true across the board, but I think that in a very tightly split nation on the national level, it costs too much to hold someone accountable, and so people don't, because they don't want to lose the Senate seat, they don't want to lose the House seat, they don't want to lose the presidency, and holding that person accountable is not worth it to them. I think there are other things that are involved as well, changing media and changing ethics and ethos in the country, but I think that's a big, that negative partisanship and negative polarization is a big part of it.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, some things you can say, like, you'll not have Mark Robinson as your senator, I don't think, for example. I don't want to predict, but it's not doing so well. But he probably would have had it even before those CNN revelations. But I also think something else is going on, which is changes in religion in America. This used to be a very religious country, and it still is compared to, say, Sweden or the Netherlands. But more and more, people's religion lines up with their politics. If you're liberal Protestant, if you're liberal Jew, you're going to be a Democrat. If you're conservative, theologically, if you're theologically conservative person, you're going to be a Republican. And so that goes along with the negative partisanship. And so, the idea that if you are accused of, or actually paid a lot of money, like Donald Trump has, for defaming the woman who said that he raped her in a dressing room in New York. Used to be that if that was accused, that you said it would have disqualified you, but now conservative Protestants, conservative Catholics, some conservative Jews too think, well, yeah, he might have done that kind of thing, but it's so much more important for him to support our policies on abortion, on gay rights, on other issues that just doesn't matter. And maybe that was in the past anyway. So the morality that religion stirred in people, and still does, of course, for a lot of people, I think is more leavened by partisanship now, I think, in a way than it used to be. And also, I showed that slide of Adam Clinton Powell Jr., very popular black politician. I mean, he got in a lot of trouble because he brought his mistresses on the government tab down to the Caribbean for vacations, and he put them on his on his staff without doing any real work. And he got in trouble, and he was investigated by Congress, but people kept electing him anyway from Harlem because he was a charismatic, pro, black civil rights a great guy, and he was our guy. So there's some of that. Some of that has always happened in American history. But now it's happening obviously on the presidential scale. Everybody you mentioned was a presidential candidate. Alan Clayton Powell was a congressman from a black district in New York, so it was a smaller scale.
So as more and more,
A little louder, if you
you want me to stand up, I can stand. Sorry, so as more and more of these candidates like, Donald Trump and George Santos and the governor of North Carolina, as they begin to pop up more and more,
Lieutenant Governor.
as what?
Lieutenant Governor.
Oh, Lieutenant Governor. So as they begin to pop up more and more, I'm reminded of the Gilded Age, this era of American history in which we had a lot of corruption, but also a lot of debauchery. Do you think that within the near future, we could also see a bigger crackdown on like these sorts of activities within Congress and the US government, just as it happened during the early 20th century under Roosevelt and other progressive presidents?
I love this question because I've been thinking about the Gilded Age a lot lately. So the question was, you have all these corrupt politicians in the late 19th century, but then you get significant reforms to deal with those corrupt politicians. You get civil service reforms, you get the complete rethinking and a constitutional amendment for the Senate, because senators had been bought up by corporations and people got so angry that they passed a constitutional amendment and to make senators elected by direct vote instead of selected by the state legislators. So could we be in the moment of like the boss tweeds of the world, where again, like you had these very corrupt politicians, but the corrupt politicians had made a bargain, which was, yeah, we're gonna line our own pockets, but we're also going to make sure you get jobs. We're gonna make sure that we have clean roads, and we're gonna make sure that the police and the firemen show up whenever you have an emergency. And that's gonna be the trade-off. We get the money and you get the public services. People are like, well, what if we got both, and you no longer were corrupt? And so they put in place all these reforms. The important thing is they didn't just make reforms to end corruption and to limit the power of corporations. They made reforms to make democracy better. Right, the reform of the Senate was part of that, but this is also the era where they introduced the secret ballot. This is the era where they introduced initiatives and referenda, because they said, you know what, if our representatives won't represent us, we are going to put into place rules that allow us to create the legislation, and then we'll vote on it, and then it will become law. And I think that that's one of the important lessons of the Gilded Age, is that in thinking about how to diminish corruption in politics, which is very hard right now. Not only are a lot of people doing it, but the Supreme Court has greenlit a lot of corruption in recent rulings. But you have to have those kind of wholesale democracy reforms as well. Because one reason that you get corruption is that you've cut off the people from the government.
Yeah, it's really a great point. And one of the things about the progressive era was that these reforms were bipartisan.
Very
I mean, you don't get constitutional amendments passed without almost every case without support of both parties. The construction amendments, not so much. No Democrats supported for the 14th or 15th Amendment in Congress. But the income tax amendment, the women's suffrage amendment, the youth prohibition amendment, which we see as a reform at the time, and of course the amendment for the population of senators, they were bipartisan. And there was a sense at the time that things had gone too far. Big business had too much power. They were buying off legislators. And also campaign finance. I mean, campaign finance is kind of a boring issue, unfortunately, and neither party runs on it, you've noticed, because people don't want to hear about it, they think it's always going to be corrupt. But there was a law passed in 1907 called the Tillman Act, after a horribly racist senator from South Carolina named Ben Tillman, which the first time said corporations can't give money directly to candidates. And of course, now they have other ways to do it, super PACs and anything else. But at the time, that was a big reform. And the Gilded Age, one of the things that happened, most people don't know this, is that in New York, especially where the county hall was so powerful, if you wanted to run for office in New York as a Democrat, you had to raise your own money and pay the machine Like, one run for mayor, you gotta be $50,000. One run for city council, man, $20,000. Want to run for auditor or something, or comptroller, lesser office, $10,000. Because that was real money back then, money now too, but, you know, the inflation, of course, gone up a lot since then. So that's how the campaigns are financed. Individuals have to raise the money themselves, and of course, they raise it from people who then they'll get a help once they got into office. But as Nicole said, also people got something, you know, if you went to jail, the boss would try to get you out. If you didn't have a job, he'd try to help you there and so forth. So, and they also turned out to vote, of course. To be a boss meant not just you made a lot of money, but you had to turn out your people. Because the elections were not as one-sided as sometimes people think they were. But the problem is we've gone so far, unfortunately, with campaign finance, both major party candidates, Harris and Trump, spent a lot of money talking to donors, that to me is the root of the corruption, I'm not opposed to some people getting rich, but I'm opposed to some people having more power in our politics because they're rich. That to me is not democratic, that's oligarchy.
Yeah, one more question.
So I know recently, Teamsters Union, did not endorse either, candidate Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, and I know that's something that's pretty unheralded considering, as we talked about earlier, the connection between the union and the Democratic Party. Historically, we talked about the demographic, just changing, but what do you think that says maybe more about, the candidates or possibly just the future of, union workers and how that, lines up down the road?
Well, it's just more about the Teamsters, actually. Teamsters, first of all, there's a lot of Teamsters who are white working class people and support Trump. And the head of the Teamsters Union, Sean O'Brien, didn't want to piss those people off. And he was invited to speak to the Republican convention. That was a very smart thing to do. And evidently spoke to Josh Hawley, senator from Missouri. And Hawley helped to convince him as well. And he was hoping to get invited to the Democratic convention too. But Democrats were pissed off that he said a lot of nice things about Trump, so they didn't invite him. And actually, at a lot of the local Teamsters union, Teamsters is a pretty decentralized union, actually, unlike some other unions. And a lot of their regional councils, a lot of the regional councils have supported Harris. In fact, most of them have so far. But it used to be that like 1908, as I mentioned, hate to go back to ancient history, but when the first time the American Federation of Labor did support a major party political candidate, their representatives went to both parties' conventions. They went to the Republican convention where William Howard Taft was going to be nominated for president, and they went to the Democratic convention where William Jennings Bryan was going to be nominated. I won't discuss what the major issues were at the time, but the Republican convention said basically, we don't need you, and the Democrats embraced them. So of course they supported the Democrats, and that began that. But there have been times, like in 1924, for example, I mentioned, the Democrats ran this very conservative guy, and the labor supported Robert LaFollette, who was a very progressive pro-labor independent candidate, of course, didn't win. In 1972, when McGovern ran, the AFL-CIO was so pro-Vietnam War, and McGovern was against the war, they didn't support Nixon, but they didn't support anybody, much like the Teamsters. But most unions, overwhelming number of unions are supporting Harris. And that's because, they feel, I think justifiably, that's minimum politics, that the Democratic Party is more friendly to unions. And ironically, also, the Teamsters pension fund was going bankrupt. And part of the provision unheralded, except unless you're a Teamster, of the Inflation Reduction Act was to actually bail out the Teamsters pension fund. So a lot of the retired workers in the Teamsters wouldn't have their pensions if it wasn't for this very narrow victory for the Inflation Reduction Act in Congress, which of course Democrats sponsored and won with only Democratic votes. So that's sort of irony about it. But I think, first of all, labor is pretty weak in the country now. It's only 10% of workers, wage earners are in unions, only 6% in the private sector, which includes the Teamsters, of course. And even some of the unions doing better, like United Auto Workers, 25% of the United Auto Workers membership are graduate students and other people working in universities. So they're not just auto workers. So unions are hanging on, basically, have not grown much in terms of the percentage of the labor force. And so Democrats have tried to cultivate them, but of course, with a very narrow majority in Congress, there's not much they can do. So, again, the kind of frustration we were talking about, a lot of working people who might be unions or most are not unions are gonna say, neither party's really doing anything for me, so some are gonna just support one part or the other because of their cultural views, because they just like Trump more, whatever, reason. People don't only vote for economic interests, obviously, that's obvious. The unions were a big supporter for Democrats, the unions were strong, and the Democrats had good reasons to be very pro-union. Now they're pro-union because they're hoping that more people would join the unions, because they know, if you're a union worker, no matter what your race or your gender, in fact, you're much more likely to vote for Democrats than not. I think in 2020, I forget the numbers, maybe you know them. Union workers voted for, private sector union workers voted for Democrats, I think 55-45. But non-union workers, working class people voted for Republicans by about 60-40. So, it's not a huge gap. It's, pretty important in elections, of course, so close as they are, that makes a big difference.
All right, well, I think we're out of time. Thank you all for coming, and please join me.
Thank you, great questions.
Yeah.